Hi, this is Matt McCormick from the Department of Philosophy at California State University, Sacramento. My email address is mccormick@csus.edu. The next address on the slide there is my course website, and the final address, www.provingthenegative.com, is my blog. In the last lecture, we explained the Kalam cosmological argument for the existence of God from William Lane Craig. That's this argument. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Philosophical analysis reveals that such a cause must have several of the principal theistic attributes. Therefore, the cause of the universe is God. Now, in this lecture, I'd like to consider a number of the objections that have come up in discussions about this argument between Craig and mathematicians, philosophers, and physicists. So first off, contrary to premise one, there do appear to be phenomena such as quantum events that come into being without being caused. That is, sometimes something does come from nothing. And the question that Craig's going to have, of course, is could the whole universe have come from nothing? And in fact, some physicists are saying yes. Lawrence Krauss, for example, a preeminent physicist from Arizona State University, he says yes. And you might also take a look at his video in our video projects assignments. But here's a recent book of his, A Universe from Nothing. And I'll leave that pursuit of that question for some outside work for you. Next. Does the first cause of the universe need to be omnipotent? That is, would bringing about the Big Bang require omnipotence? And at first glance, it sure seems like the answer would be yes, given the massive amount of energy, the complexity, the enormity of the Big Bang. It seems like we'd say, well, you'd have to be omnipotent if you can bring something about like that. But let's consider these two possibilities. Imagine some being has a power, the ability to bring about only our Big Bang and nothing else, versus a being has the ability to bring about our Big Bang and infinitely many other Big Bangs or possible universes. Now, from our side, it would be invisible which one of these beings was responsible. That is, the Kalam argument only seems to require A, but B power is greater than A, so it doesn't appear that the Kalam argument has proven omnipotence. Now, the same thing goes for omniscience. Is omniscience required? Must the first cause be omniscience? Omniscient? At first glance, we might think that the vastness and complexity of the universe might entail infinite knowledge in its creator, but again, consider two levels of knowledge. One, possessing only the minimal knowledge necessary to create our universe versus possessing all the knowledge to create any possible universe. Now again, clearly B is greater than A, but the Kalam conclusion only requires A. Therefore, the Kalam argument doesn't demonstrate omniscience either. And we might ask, as long as we're on the question, how does God have knowledge without a brain? That is, I don't think typically on theistic views people think that God actually possesses a brain. And the reason I ask is because every example of a creature with knowledge that we know of has a brain as a physical substrate in which it's embedded. So does God have a brain? And if so, where is it? I don't think people think he does. And if he doesn't, then how is it he's able to possess knowledge? How does that work exactly? And I don't pretend to be able to answer those questions right now, but they're certainly relevant for our consideration. Now, what about infinite goodness? Must the first cause be infinitely good or morally perfect? And I think here, even more clearly, the answer is a resounding no. We don't have resounding evidence that shows that whatever's in charge or whoever's in charge must be infinitely good. And here's why. In another set of discussions in the philosophy of religion, in the problem of evil discussions, there's an even more fundamental issue. There, people are asking this question. Given the quantity and distribution of apparently pointless suffering in the world, is it reasonable to think that there is possibly a good God? That is, over there, they're arguing over whether or not the apparently pointless suffering we see in the world is compatible with God's existence. So it's an open question there, and some people are even arguing that there is no God on the basis of all of the suffering. So would anyone suggest over here in the cosmological discussion Would anybody suggest seriously, given the quantity and distribution of suffering, that the only possible explanation is that there's an infinitely good, omnipotent being in charge? That is, cosmological arguments are trying to read off the properties of God from nature. Now, when we look at childhood leukemia, genocide, horrible natural disasters, warfare, bubonic plague, child abuse, and the like, do all of those events then indicate that whatever's going on here must be the product of infinite goodness? And I think the fact that that's at least controversial shows that the cosmological argument can't read off goodness from nature. That is, neither the Kalam argument nor any of the other common cosmological arguments.
And I don't think they can show that omnibenevolence is one of the basis of first cause or Big Bang reasoning. All right, so what are we doing here? What's a way to summarize those three objections? Well, think of it this way. We're down here in the natural world. We're considering this Big Bang cosmology issue scenario. And on the basis of this argument, everything that begins has a cause. The universe began, therefore the universe had a cause. And now we're trying to engage in this philosophical, conceptual reasoning to try to draw some inferences about what sort of cause must that be. Now, given the objections I've just outlined, it would appear that at a minimum, what might be justified by the Kalam argument is this: some force or forces of unknown power, possibly natural or supernatural, possibly conscious or possibly not, with indeterminate knowledge and moral properties, appears to have been responsible for the Big Bang. But of course, what millions of Americans believe and what Craig believes is in an omni-God, an omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent God, the God of Christianity. The Christian God, the almighty, morally perfect creator of the universe, who sent Jesus to humans for moral and spiritual salvation, exists. And even worse, 4 in 10 Americans are young earth creationists. The universe, the earth, and all life, they say, were created in their more or less present form approximately 10,000 years ago. So there's an enormous difference between what the Kalam argument or cosmological arguments seem to prove at a minimum, if we're being charitable, and what people actually believe. I'm going to call this the gap, the difference between what these arguments can reasonably show, even if we're being charitable, and what people in fact believe. That is to say that omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence, personal, singular, conscious, those are all properties that are underdetermined by cosmological arguments. Okay, now, can God be infinite in these arguments? Do cosmological arguments have this implication? If we can show, if we argue that actually infinite things are impossible, but we also hold the view that God is actually infinite, then now we've got the implication that God is impossible. But that can't be what the cosmological advocate wants. They don't want to show that God's impossible. They just want to show that an infinite universe is impossible. So you've got this problem with infinity. What exactly is the problem with infinity such that the universe can't have it, but God can? And I'm going to call this the 6 in 1, half a dozen, and the other problem. Cosmological arguments must reject an infinite universe, but accept an infinite God. Now, how can you do that on a consistent, rational basis without ad hoc justifications, that is, saving a cherished conclusion from an objection with a special unjustified assumption, or special pleading, insisting that a claim is exempt from a general principle without justifying the exemption? I mean, you can't just say, oh, well, infinity is okay with God, but you can't have an infinite universe. An infinite universe, that's crazy talk. Infinite God, oh, that's fine. Look, you can't have it both ways. There's got to be some principled way to separate the two. So cosmological arguments owe us, or the advocates of those arguments, owe us some explanation of how it is, some principled explanation that's not an ad hoc justification for how it is that infinity won't work with universes but will work with God. All right, so next we've got a more abstract and technical set of objections coming from mathematicians and philosophers of mathematics. And it has to do with what Hilbert said about infinite sets. David Hilbert had designed Hilbert's Hotel to illustrate the counterintuitive properties of infinite sets, but he certainly didn't think that they were logically impossible, nor do the rest of mathematicians. That's to say, the rules for equality are different for infinite and finite sets, and here's why.
By definition, an infinite set is a set that can be put into a one-to-one correspondence with a proper subset of itself. That is, we can pull a subset of an infinite set out and then take each of the members of that subset and match them up with a member of the infinite set without there being any leftovers. So infinite sets have this weird property where we can take a part of the infinite set, pull it out, and then line it up and match it with the members of the original set, but they all line up and there's none of them left over. And why is that weird? Well, imagine a finite set, say, of 20 books, 10 of them red and 10 of them blue. Now, if we try to match each red book with a book in the original set, we'll end up with 10 left over. A subset of a finite set can't be put into a one-to-one correspondence with the whole. But with infinite sets, they can be. And that's what produces this bizarre, this counterintuitive outcome in the Hilbert's Hotel example. But that doesn't show they're impossible, and that's because the two kinds of mathematics, the two realms, have different rules. To be infinite means that a subset is equal to the whole. For example, the number of integers is equal to the number of even integers. So in this case, despite the fact that the first one looks like it's double the second one, these two are equal because of the rules of the way infinite sets interact. Equality works differently for finite and infinite sets. Now, Craig seems to reject infinite sets on the basis of rules that apply to finite sets. Because for a finite set A plus 2 is not equal to A. So 10 plus 2, for example, is not equal to 10. But for infinite sets, infinity plus 2 is still equal to infinity. The alleged logical contradiction here appears to arise from an equivocation on what equals means. And here's Bertrand Russell, the discoverer of set theory himself, explaining the problem, rather grumpily, I'll say. The whole difficulty of the subject lies in the necessity of thinking in an unfamiliar way and in realizing that many properties which we have thought inherent in number are in fact peculiar to finite numbers. If this is remembered, the positive theory of infinity will not be found so difficult as it is to those who cling obstinately to the prejudices instilled by the arithmetic which is learned in childhood. So Russell's saying, look, there's different rules here. And if you stick to your intuitions about finite rules, then things are going to look bizarre and difficult, but they're not logically contradictory. Furthermore, it would appear that actual infinities are real by the reckoning of most mathematicians. George Cantor and the mathematics community, for the most part, seems to accept that actual infinities are coherent, epistemically sound, and real. Now, what's happened and when he's been told this is that Craig has argued that the academic mathematics community is wrong about this particular issue. So I will leave that to your further pursuit, say, in a graduate seminar on the philosophy of mathematics. Now, the next objection I'd like to consider, perhaps the most serious objection, seems to come from Craig himself. When Craig is asked for response to a question about how to deal with doubt or criticisms of one's reasons for believing in God, he has this to say.
First of all, I think that I would tell them that they need to understand the proper relationship between faith and reason. And my view here is that the way in which I know Christianity is true is first and foremost on the basis of the witness of the Holy Spirit in my heart. And that this gives me a self-authenticating means of knowing that Christianity is true wholly apart from the evidence. And therefore, if in some historically contingent circumstances the evidence that I have available to me should turn against Christianity, I don't think that controverts the witness of the Holy Spirit. In such a situation, I should regard that as simply a result of the contingent circumstances that I'm in, and that if I were to pursue this with due diligence and with time, I would discover that in fact the evidence, if I could get the correct picture, would support exactly what the witness of the Holy Spirit tells me.
This is really a quite remarkable thing that Craig says here. He knows that Christianity is true wholly apart from the evidence. And what he said is that he is going to subordinate reason to that article of faith. Now, we were taking the Kalam argument to be an appeal to the evidence to prove that God exists. We were trying, and I thought Craig was trying, but we were trying to figure out what caused the universe. But it turns out that what Craig is up to is something very different, despite it looking like he's after the same answer. So imagine that we conduct an investigation into all of the evidence we have. We're open to any possible outcome. We gather all of the relevant evidence in as objective and fair and broad a way possible. And then we apply the canons of deductive and inductive logic, and we draw the conclusion that is then indicated by that evidence. So that's a fair and unbiased investigation where we're neutral with regard to what conclusion is the outcome. And it would have appeared that the Kalam argument was that sort of inquiry. But here we've realized now that what Craig's actually doing is something very different. Craig already believes the conclusion. He is determined to subordinate reason to that. He believes it wholly apart from the evidence. And what he's actually engaged in is a search for evidence or a construction of argument that must be driven or directed by the conclusion that he's already accepted prior. That is, Craig admits that he won't allow that any evidence could possibly count against his faith. Reason is subordinate to faith. So Craig won't countenance any argument or evidence that doesn't corroborate his theism. He's not prepared to consider any of that. So, for example, take all of the objections that I've just listed off in the past several slides. Now, Craig has and will object vociferously to all of those objections, and he'll maintain that his argument is still sound. But now something different has happened in the way we should treat his argument, because it looks like Craig has disqualified the Kalam argument from serious rational consideration, given his prior commitment to one and only one conclusion. Despite it looking like he's playing the same game as those of us who are trying to figure out what the cause of the universe is, he's not. Craig's playing by only one game where the rules all and only end up with the outcome that God exists. And that's very different than an objective, broad-based, unbiased search for evidence and an objective, unbiased contemplation of the arguments that might support support theism. All right, so in conclusion, let's wrap up here. We've got several objections that are in play. Physicists are arguing that something can, in fact, come from nothing, including possibly the universe. Cosmological arguments suffer from something I've called the gap. It's not clear how they can establish that the first cause must be omnipotent, omniscient, or omnibenevolent. We've asked this question: why does an infinite God make sense, but an infinite universe does not? And this is the 6 in 1, half a dozen in the other problem. Craig argues that Hilbert's hotel produces a logical contradiction, but equalities for infinite sets aren't the same as they are for finite sets, and we've seen that mathematicians maintain that the rules are different and that actual infinities are real, that there's nothing logically contradictory about infinite sets, although they are counterintuitive. And Craig insists that reasoning and evidence must be made to fit his faith the way around,
and that he knows that theism is true, and this, I maintain, apparently disqualifies Kalam for serious, rational discussion. Those object to the Kalam cosmological argument that exists of God.